This is Bimbo Bookshelf, a podcast focused on books, literature, and love of learning. Each episode is hosted by two friends, Brittany and Sophia, and occasionally includes co-hosts, interviews, and listener voicemails. Join us on the never-ending wormhole of books and topics that pique our interest, and reach out to us through Instagram DMs or email at bimbobookshelf@gmail.com to be part of the conversation. Today we're continuing our conversation on Robert Anton Wilson's book, Prometheus Rising. Wilson was an American author whose fiction and nonfiction work spanned a tremendous breadth of topics, from consciousness exploration, conspiracy theory, futurism, mysticism, agnosticism, to politics and psychology. Wilson was perhaps best known for his exploration and expansion of Leary's eight-circuit model of consciousness theory, which Prometheus Rising is primarily about. In our last episode, we discussed Wilson's major influences and the first four circuits as discussed in Prometheus Rising. So if you haven't given that episode a listen, check it out now. As we conclude our conversation about the final four circuits, we'll also share our thoughts on the book in its entirety, our takeaways, what we liked, loved, and could do without. So, listen on as we get into the realms of neurobiology, psychology, consciousness, and the occult. In ordinary language, the semantic circuit is usually called the quote-unquote mind. As psychologist Robert Ornstein said in a recent radio show, when we say someone has a good mind, we generally mean they have a good mouth. This means they use their semantic circuit well. In terms of transactional analysis, the first circuit, oral, is called the natural child. The second circuit, emotional, is called the adapted child. The semantic circuit is called the adult or computer. In Jungian terms, the first circuit meditates sensation, the second feeling, and the third reason. So the reason I read that is because it kind of is explaining what he means by the semantic circuit, which is where we're at in the book now. This is the third semantic circuit. So he's starting to talk about reason and our adult brain. And in my opinion, this is where the book starts getting a little bit harder to follow, because it starts to step outside of what is like the most socially accepted and taught psychological understandings and philosophies, like Jung, Sagan, whoever, and starts really stepping more into the world of Leary and his 8 models of consciousness and the way that it differentiates. Well, I don't know if I would say differentiates, the way that it adds on to what we already understand about our brain development. And
right,
it gets kind of weird.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking that too. I realized that part of what I was reading with Brooks too was in the chapter that precedes this. But yeah, this is where like it really is a breakdown of the 8 models and this way that Leary sees things, which is like both very Jungian and also very esoteric. Even like the stuff with the tarot, I don't know if you've gotten into that, like it's in the following chapter. Despite that being, kind of my wheelhouse, I was like really, really confused by it the first time that I read this, just because it's also super Kabbalistic, so like Kabbalah with a Q, and just a lot of stuff that I think is, we've already talked a lot about how dense this book is, but then it just gets even more.
Yeah, I feel like for this episode, I'm doing a little bit more reading from the book than I was previously, because I don't know how else to explain this book but to say it out loud. At some point.
I think it makes a lot of stuff click, honestly, for you to do that.
Yeah, and towards the end of this chapter on the semantic circuit, I'm going to read one more thing. He goes on to say, As with earlier circuits, the semantic circuit builds all of its conditioning and learning onto the bedrock of hardwired imprinting. Thus, many existentially thinkable thoughts are socially unthinkable, since A, everybody in a given society has roughly the same semantic imprint, and B, this is reinforced daily by assumptions that are mechanically taken for granted. This is something that they also talk about in Ishmael, about the laws of civilization.
I was just thinking that.
And we really, I think, after doing this book, we have been talking about which book from the club we need to do a podcast on next, and I just feel like the right answer is going to be Ishmael, because there's so much from this book that is relatable to that book. And I'm pretty sure Ishmael was written in the early 90s, and this was written in the early 70s. So almost a full generation after.
I know that Ishmael was like a work in progress over decades, but that iteration appeared in the early 90s. It was just interesting to me that this is such a future-seeking book, such a, like, in many ways, super scientific, and, like, he talks a lot about life extension technology and cryogenics, and even, like, the idea of never dying, or, like, life on other planets. And in many ways, like, because, you know, spoiler, a lot of people who love Ishmael are kind of, like, anarcho-primitive, or, like, tend to lean towards, like, a lot of, like, more natural, crunchy kind of stuff. So it's, like, in many ways you could say that there's, like, a disparate themes, but it's so interesting that you and I both see, like, there's very clear connections to both of these books, and I think it's, like, for one, they're about civilization, and then, in effect, like, captivity, and then, like, I think that Prometheus Rising really is, like, a guidebook of freeing your mind from the captivity of both, like, civilization and the way that socialization can be subject to, like, other people's ideas about how you should be, and also just from, like, our what he calls robotized reactions to things, the way that our evolutionary mind has kept us safe, you know, for thousands of generations, but also now maybe we could evolve beyond that.
I don't know how much people have listened to, but I have talked a little bit about the inspiration of this book club pretty much coming from one book that Sophia gave to me, and it was Ishmael. That book reignited my love for learning. It made me, every page that I turned, it was a book that was for me. It was a book that made me go, oh my gosh, yes, I feel this way, but I didn't understand it fully. And it's not necessarily that it's even that groundbreaking of a book. That book gets a lot of shit from people with philosophical minds. They call it, like, someone, I forget where it was, but when we were doing that book, someone made a comment about it being like elementary philosophy for babies, which maybe that's why it was great for Bimbo Bookshelf. I had just never read anything like that. When I read books when I was younger, it was always fantasy and, like, escapism, and, you know, I started off on Harry Potter, which got me into, like, Lord of the Rings when I was older, and, like, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, but at a certain point, those stories didn't captivate me anymore, and I kind of tried to force myself to read, and I would pick up different genres of books, but my love of learning and my love of reading kind of faded away. In that book, I just picked it up, and it made me feel like I want to talk to someone about this. Every time I see something in this book, I want to add on to it. I want to communicate about this. I want to have a conversation and see if other people think this way. And it was really great to be able to communicate with you about that. And like this circuit talks about in back to the book, it talks about how our cultural imprinting and the way we're conditioned, the overculture, which is the link that I see with Ishmael, so many things go into play with that. It's so nuanced, but I do think this is also really relevant with a lot of our own cultural issues. Like, the cultural imprinting is, by and large, like, also part of the reasoning for our cultural issues. Like, the shit's a double-edged sword is what I'm saying. Being molded by a culture that inhibits your ideas, which actions that you take, like which ways of life are acceptable, unacceptable, even language and communication, which is one of our biggest root issues. I know a lot of people that I have, like, real meaningful life conversations with often feel frustrated because of not being able to get through to people or get their point across, and not just because they can't articulate it well, but because we're dancing around the rules of culture. And it does make you question not just the way that you think, but the way that you communicate, and it makes it hard to communicate effectively. People are worried that they'll come across the wrong way or misidentify, misrepresent themselves, which can culturally be very dangerous because there are a lot of people out there that are dangerous. So people look for cues in words and language as to what to stay away from. But it also makes it hard to articulate and understand the world and the culture around you, and that's also the thing that's like limiting your ability to communicate and to connect with people on a genuine level.
What you're saying is super important, because I actually think, besides like Ishmael being like this connective tissue for both of us, like kind of a key to a lot of different things that I think we both tried to unfurl, and I love how you put that about the book. I also just appreciate my conversations with you as being really sanity provoking because of this issue that you're speaking to, of like this kind of difficulty connecting with people on a like real or intimate or vulnerable level, and not even just to be like super close, but just to like be honest, I guess it is like maybe the right way to put it, without like either the social niceties or like you're saying the fear of like someone not receiving what you're saying well, or having to like preface it or have to have a lot of energy because the social expectation is so different. Like, you know, describing a situation where someone is like so clearly feels vindicated in what they're saying that they're describing something completely insane, and yet expecting you to like agree with them, you know, right. Situations like that, or even just not feeling like you can discuss having different topics or like different views on different topics. So I appreciate you kind of speaking to that, and I just appreciate that about our conversations. And
I do too. I also very much value that about our friendship, and I think part of that may be rooted in the experiences that we have had in life, growing up in a cult and leaving and having all of your cultural, all of your familial, all of your every structure in your life shattered, all your illusions shattered, to come out into a world where you feel like there's a whole new set of them. And I have always kind of navigated in the world feeling a little lost, trying to adapt to social norms and not really understanding them, and then just not caring. And it makes me honestly feel disconnected from people a lot of time. It's something as an adult, though, that I struggle with, but I value at the same time. I value that I am able to break down expectations and rebuild them without it shattering my whole world. But I do find it hard to connect and communicate with people a lot of times because of growing up in a cult and then stepping back into this whole new society and civilization. It's like we went through the 4 steps of our end of our civilization, and then we hopped into a new one. And yes. It's weird to navigate, and that might not be terribly relevant for many people that listen to this, but it's just something that I found really fascinating about this part of the book, and it's something that I'm just going to keep talking about, trying to make sense of, but gosh, we've spent so much time on this chapter anyway. I don't know if you want to look, I can't remember if we looked at all of the end chapter exercises, so I'll let you do.
The exercises, hang on. If you are a liberal, subscribe to the National Review, the country's most intelligent and witty conservative magazine, for a year. Each month, try to enter their reality tunnel for a few hours while reading their articles. If you're a conservative, subscribe to the New York Review of Books for a year and try to get into their headspace for a few hours a month. If you're a rationalist, subscribe to Fate magazine for a year. If you are an occultist, join the Committee for Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal and read their journal, The Skeptical Inquirer, for a year. That one was a mouthful. Buy a copy of the Scientific American and read any article in it. Ask the following questions. Why do they sound so sure? How does the data support dogmatism at this point? Will these theories still be believed in 2011? In 2593? Get into a discussion of philosophy with an educated Marxist, an intelligent Muslim, and a Japanese businessman at the first opportunity. Oh man. Yeah. And then last one. Buy some Zoom or Lyft. 2 names for the same caffeine high stimulant at the health food store. He's all about a health food store. Even though he's basically like, yeah, buy caffeine pills. It says parentheses, this gives you a close approximation of the effects of illegal cocaine. When you are zooming or lifted and your mind is racing, find a victim and explain the universe to him or her until they are able to escape you. When you experience, and this speed rap is what the head of a compulsive rationalist is always like. This is the verbal circuit gone wild and totally oblivious to the information coming into any other circuit. It explains why most people cannot stand.
I love these exercises. It's saying if you believe in something wholeheartedly, listen to the opposing side. Try and get in the mindset of why the people or thing that you disagree with so much believes it, and see if you can make sense of it. See what of it you believe. I think it challenges sometimes your real connection to the things that you believe. I know a big thing growing up for us was that secular education was not acceptable. You weren't supposed to go to college. You weren't supposed to read books or literature that weren't directly from the organization. You weren't supposed to read anything negative about it because, of course, it was directly from the devil. It's really easy to forget that when you only consume things that reaffirm your bias, your ideas, morals, personality, votes, whatever, these things we base huge parts of our lives around. If we commit to living in an echo chamber of it, we not only limit our minds to growth, but to really understanding our own unique ideas and beliefs. The human experience is so unique and complex, and when we get stuck in these pattern thinking cycles, the constant consumption of media that consoles one stream or other of, systemic ideas, we limit our ways that we connect not only with ourselves, but I think the community as a whole, our families, our neighbors, I don't know. And even though I don't think this should have to be said, I do feel the need to mention that does not mean that you should tolerate any hatred or violent behavior, actions, language, anything like that. You don't need to put yourself in that kind of a position to learn and grow. And if it feels that way, that's a dangerous situation and not the kind of situation that I'm talking about. You don't need to entertain racism, homophobia, violence, hatred, or bigotry of any kind. See how you can communicate differently. See what you can reaffirm that you don't need. It's just good to challenge your thinking, I think, which is what Wilson does consistently in his writing. So despite the crazy stuff that he does sometimes talk about, I think that's what is easiest for me to follow.
Yeah, I feel like that's like a consistent theme of his work. If you had to try to summarize it, it's just this, like, continually reminding us on the different ways in which we have perceptual limitations, and then kind of encouraging people to alter or expand that perception. So I loved those exercises. I feel like another element of that, like, difficulty to relating to people often can be this sense that like one's identity really is keyed into who you are as a person. So like criticizing something, a thought or an idea or a movement or even like a, I don't know, brand could be like in some way criticizing someone as a person, which I think that's something that anyone who has, and I don't say this I feel like this sounds a little, I don't know, whatever. If you've read anything in the realm of spirituality or like consciousness expansion, that's kind of like, I feel like a 101 lesson. It's just you are not your thoughts, you are not your beliefs, you are not your ideas, or your, not over-identifying with the separate self. That's like a core Buddhist thought, and it's something that Wilson talks a lot in his work, and I do think that people, by and large, could benefit from that. It's something I have to consistently remind myself of, because I can, of course, speak to my own reaction, to things, and not wanting to, like, just be overly critical, but, yeah.
It's so easy to do that in this day and age where we over-identify ourselves with our ego, essentially, and our thoughts and reality tunnel is the way that Wilson explains it. But we over-identify with, like you said, it could be brands, it could be politics, it could be a band, it could be whatever, and it becomes a part of who you are, and it almost becomes... There's another book that I just recently read called Cultish by Amanda. I don't know, I'll find it and I'll put her in the show notes. I can't remember. Anyway, she's a linguist, and she talks about this in relation to cults and how pretty much to some degree you could say that anything is a cult. You said a brand, Lululemon. Yeah, that's it.
I don't know. I've
like
never
lemon.
heard it
I think
pronounced.
that's the one. I don't know. You know what? Maybe I could be dragging this brand and it's the wrong one. She talks about one in there, but anyway, all to say that, like, even a pair of workout clothes, people can become fanatical about and over-identify with, and it's not necessarily the workout clothes themselves, but it's the culture around it, because of where we are at culturally. A lot of people feel that they don't identify, that they are lost in the environments that they're raised in or put into, that they find communities and latch onto them, and sometimes it's healthy and sometimes it's not, and sometimes we over-identify and sometimes we know that balance, and it's important to be aware of, because I think that, like you said, it's something that we all do, either cognitively or not, becoming so identified and attached to things and ideas and politics that we don't even question what we really think and believe, because we want to identify. We need that sense of community. We need that sense of belonging. And sometimes it takes over. And it's really good to question yourself and ask why you think the way that you do, or why you see things the way that you do. Are you doing it because it's what you believe and feel and want, or is it because what's expected, or it's because this is the way it's done, or this is the way that your group does it? It's important to always be honest with yourself.
Yeah, and I feel like also normalizing, changing that, shifting that consistently, like, and not just because, the culture or the like over culture is telling you to, but because maybe there's new information or things that have, like, shifted. And I feel like that's also been a big part of all of the books that we've read, is that there's been a component of them, like, shifting or altering our, I don't know if you want to say beliefs, but, like, our perspectives in some way.
So the next circuit, gosh, we have so many to cover. The next circuit is on chapter 8. So we're skipping another chapter, chapter 7. The next chapter is the moral socio-sexual circuit. The beginning of this chapter has another great image. We have a lot of great imagery in this book. They are interestingly drawn characters. So this one I'm going to try and explain a little bit. There is a person on a, gosh,
like
what do
a
you
conveyor
belt?
belt?
I don't know if you're looking at it. Yeah, like a conveyor belt. And there's a scientific-ish looking dude with his big round glasses and lab coat with an approved stamp, and he's stamping the specimen on the head and sending them into shipment and assignment, and it says, "Good programming makes good neighbors." And I think that
I
is
love that.
Really what this chapter is about, and if you don't want to read it, there you go.
Yeah, this was one that
right,
is really, like, the one that I think I was at least alluding to when I said that there's some stuff in here that I wouldn't necessarily say it's aged poorly, in as much as it reflects a very specific mindset that I think is just kind of difficult to both get into and unpack and speak to with any level of nuance. I think it's important to name that Leary had a very Freudian perspective from his like psychological training, and he was just raised in a very different era and like taught received his PhD from like a school of thought that really no longer exists in psychotherapy anymore. So a lot of stuff is like incredibly, I think, kind of comes across a little regressive, and it's I guess stereotypicalization of things. And I guess I just want to name that this is kind of the chapter that somewhat touches on the fact that Leary did kind of like utilize essentially what we would call now conversion therapy, and that was something that he used acid for.
Oh my God.
So
I had no idea about that with Leary. He's not someone that I know a whole lot about. Mostly I've learned from him through Wilson's books. Gosh, that's really...
And I would guess I would frame it as saying like he was a psychotherapist who had a patient who sought treatment no longer wanting to be a gay man anymore, like wanting to be heterosexual. So it wasn't that he was necessarily like, and we could definitely say that there's like obviously social pressures and all kinds of like regressive thinking in the dominant era of like psychotherapy at that time about those sorts of things. It wasn't necessarily like telling people they had to change.
Well, this is one thing about going back and looking back at older works. You oftentimes find that. I think the regression is to what you're expecting around the topic, and it's not necessarily that they had all of the answers, because they're also very heavily influenced by their time. But being able to look back at this and on them as writers and to say, okay, this is what they did that was unacceptable, that we need to steer away from, and this is what we can dig insight out of. Although it's definitely important to note, you don't want to put these authors and writers on a pedestal. And they were definitely very flawed in a lot of things. What I do know about Leary is that he was very problematic. To what degrees, I do not know. I think I heard that he escaped jail at one point.
Yeah, I do feel like that's a cool,
that.
kind of a cool story about him, which is telling of my values. But yeah, like the Weather Underground busted him out of jail. Like an alt-left group. Right, I know, like that's the thing. Get you a friend who will bust you out of jail. This is a prerequisite for me for friendship. So
one thing I do like about this chapter is the part where he talks about specialization being for insects. This was actually one of the things that the first time I read this book stuck out to me. Maybe it's because of the image. There's an ant on a metal beam with a ratchet in its hand doing some construction.
So funny.
He says specialization is for insects, and he basically is talking about the same thing, like changing your perspective, shifting your ideas. And I'm going to read a little bit from the book. He says, it is the function of the nervous system to focus, to select, to narrow down, to choose from an infinity of possibilities. The biochemical imprints which determine the tactics and strategies that ensure survival in one place, status in one tribe. The infant is genetically prepared to learn any language, master any skill, play any sex role in a very short time. However, he or she becomes mechanically, robotically fixated to accept, follow, and mimic the limited offerings of his social and cultural environment. In this process, each of us pays a heavy price. Survival and status mean forfeiting the infinite possibilities of unconditioned consciousness. The domesticated primate inside the social reality tunnel is a trivial fragment of the potentials for experience and intelligence innate in the 110 trillion or billion, I'm not good with numbers, cell human biocomputer. As Robert A. Heinlein wrote, a human being should be able to change a diaper, plan an invasion, butcher a hog, design a building, con a ship, write a sonnet, balance accounts, build a wall, set a bone, comfort the dying, take orders, give orders, cooperate, act alone, solve an equation, analyze a new problem, pitch manure, program a computer, cook a tasty meal, fight efficiently, die gallantly. Specialization is for insects. This is something that I read and I was like, oh yeah, let's do it. Oh.
Yes, I love that quote. I was really hoping that you were going to read that.
I couldn't do a podcast on this book and not read this because it's something that I took from this book that I thought that I could pass along to everyone. Like I said, not that everyone wants to hear it, but I think it's relatable to everyone, and that is sometimes hard to find in Bob's writing. But I think that we've all had different phases and different things in life that we've just wanted to pursue that wasn't for us. It wasn't the thing we were supposed to do, or we had to focus too much on the other thing. I mean, who has the time, really? No one has the time to do all of these things. That's really the issue, I think. I'm sure all of us would love to do most of these things besides the manure part. I don't know too many people that want to do that.
I don't know.
But we're so capable of learning and growing and changing our mind in so many ways that our tunnel of reality simply just has to be one as well. I mean, if we are capable of doing all of these things, we're capable of thinking so much. I do believe that we have some cute little howl meows in this episode, and I love it.
Well,
honestly.
that's actually Baby Soup who came in through the window.
Baby Soup came to visit. Oh. Well, we obviously have to keep this and include pictures of them in the show notes.
I don't think that it's like, to say that we should throw out this kind of like this chapter or even this like person's thinking. And I definitely think that Robert Anton Wilson had a really progressive view of things like sex and sexuality and gender. And he was someone who interpreted Leary's work really generously. But, I thought it was also good how you put it that there's just ways of kind of like still finding things that are useful and, not being, I guess, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak.
Right, which is kind of what we're trying to do here with the book club. Whatever books get thrown our way, we just dig into and take what we can and leave the rest. But I appreciate your knowledge on Leary and other components about this book so we can talk about it a little bit more honestly. I wish I could dive into every author, but I simply don't know that much, and who has the time?
I know, that's not going to be the cue for this episode. Who has the time? And yet this is a book that is literally like, as I'm getting deeper into this chapter that we're trying to summarize, I'm like, oh shit, here's this like whole
so how do we even do it? Underneath, after he talks about the comparison in the first 4, he goes on to talk a little bit about basically like sexuality and social norms, and it says at the bottom something blah blah blah. Why is it that while no two societies can agree on what is sexually quote-unquote good and sexually quote-unquote bad, every society thinks that it must make some definition? I mean, I don't think there's something wrong with trying to define what's not good.
Right.
As an entire society, that's sort of hard to do, and I think some people get confused about that and believe that their own personal convictions of feelings about themselves need to be placed onto others, and their ideas of what they want in their life and their belief systems should be given to others, and that's not okay. How do you really define the difference of how to define what's good and what's bad? I think to some degree, societally, most people agree on what's bad. And I'm not getting too deep into this, but I understand that this chapter is really kind of focused around that, and it talks about what that can do to a person in their mindset when your sexuality or morality or sense of identity there is not socially accepted. I'm trying to dig a little bit more in this chapter, but like you said, without fully reading this entire chapter, it's kind of difficult because it is a little regressive, and it's not something that I fully understand the way that they were looking at it. I'm just reading through here. We might have to just delete some of this, because what is this? What circuit even is this? It says, blah, blah, blah. The fourth circuit is located on the left neocortex, the newest part of the left hemisphere of the brain. It is linked neurologically with the genitalia and the breasts. Fucking, hugging, embracing, protecting circuitry. I think it's understandable why this one's hard to get into. So, you know what? Read the book. There is some interesting bits down here where he compares the circuits to the tarot. And I know our esoteric bitches out there will be interested in that. Me too.
Yeah, this was a fun one. That was what I was talking about when I was like, oh, when I first read this, I was genuinely perplexed. But now that I've been...
Oh, this is what you were talking about. That's right. Because I honestly don't remember this before. My understanding of the tarot is limited and much different than yours.
He pretty much just, like, if I could try to give a summary, he tries to break down the four circuits into associations with the court cards in the tarot, and Leary's perspective on the tarot is linked to like his relationship with the Kabbalah and the like 4-part divine name like Yud He Vav He, and that significance in Kabbalah and like alchemical works. There is this kind of breakdown of 2-part masculine, 2-part feminine coming together that he kind of links up to the tarot, and I feel like then breaks down further into the circuits, and it is really dense, and I feel like kind of difficult to otherwise explain further. Another cat has just joined. But
he talks more on, there's this next page, it says something about conditioning, moral or immoral, robot obedient versus robot disobedient, solid citizen versus sexual outlaw, parent or anarchist. So basically I feel like that's the gist of this chapter. In a bimbified, I don't know. We'll have to work on that part.
That's perfect. I mean, we needed that summary.
Yeah. There are probably other people out there that can explain this chapter and dive into it more, but we're working with the best that we've got. Okay, you all gave us this insane book here on the Bimbo bookshelf, and we're doing our best. And the exercises, I
do love them. I think they're pretty much what we were saying about the last chapter. They're like, a lot of it breaks down just changing your perspective, but they're really specific to like sex and sexuality. And I thought they were really fun.
Yeah, and you know what? I think we are going to let that pique your curiosity, and then you go find this book and see what they are.
I love that, because this is a chapter I think everyone should read. It is interesting. It is like worth kind of exploring.
And it's for you to bring your own reality tunnel to, and you tell us what you take away from it, because we would really love to hear back from people about this book, any input that they have, things that you took away that we probably didn't, parts that you listened to this and you're like, oh my god, they have no clue what they're talking about, let me explain this. Tell us. I just really fascinated by this book. It's interesting. I never read a book like this. Oh my gosh. You know, we had said previously that we were just going to do the circuits, but if we do that, Sophia, we're going to skip chapter 9.
The best chapter.
Mind washing and brain programming.
I was just thinking that, like, and this is where we get triggered.
Right? I just kind of feel like we're going to have to make an exception here. Yeah, let's see here. Okay, so in chapter 9, mind washing and brain programming, here he's talking about young... Oh, this is the chapter that has the story of Patty Hearst.
Okay.
He's talking about someone that was radicalized, brainwashed. And so I think that is just setting up what people see as brainwashing, I guess. That's why this is brought up here.
Yeah, I feel like he kind of basically said, like, most people wouldn't necessarily experience getting kidnapped, but there's different ways in which we experience, like, societal coercion into a different reality tunnel or embrace one ourselves. He gives the example also of, like, being drafted. So I think, this example is so interesting because it's one that I feel like people of this era are really familiar with, and I've never really done a lot of research into this whole thing, but I think she may have been the same person who, like, I feel like, isn't that the whole idea of, like, Stockholm Syndrome, or is that something different? I don't know. We should take his note.
I think Stockholm Syndrome, oh my gosh, yeah, really. People are going to be listening to this being like, oh my God.
Listen, it's in the name of the podcast.
I think Stockholm Syndrome is where you, like, start to have sympathy for your captors.
Yeah, but I think that's the thing, is that she did take on the perspective and opinion of the SLA who had been her kidnapper. So I wonder where it comes from. I'm trying to find the story of Stockholm Syndrome. Oh, it was first used from a bank robbery in Stockholm, Sweden. So yeah, I don't know. I'm going to have to do more digging on this. Maybe we can put a little note in the background. But he basically goes on to talk about all his different ways he views human society as a quote-unquote vast brainwashing machine whose whole semantic rules and sex roles create a social robot. I love that line.
Is a really great summary of these current few chapters, and I think it goes right into chapter 10, how to brainwash friends and robotize people, because the first page it's before the first page of the chapter, there's like a beginning to the chapter, an introduction. It just says chapter 10, how to brainwash friends and robotize people, and underneath it says, there is no government, no industrial military complex, no economic system, no mass media that can ever reduce us to puppets and robots as thoroughly as the biological and environmental dictatorships have, which I think is what he was saying. And a lot of his point in this book, that is a quote from F.N. Esfandri from Upwingers.
Such an odd...
This book is challenging me.
Well, that's another one I'm like, do not Google it, cannot go down another rabbit hole.
I'm not saying that I believe, side with, or even understand all of this book, but I do think that summarizes this last couple of chapters in going into brainwashing. And
if
I think I talked a little...
No, I'm sorry. I didn't want to cut you off, but I was just going to say this, my little aside here, topical to some of the other stuff that we were talking about, like with current society and like our attempts to connect with other people. I was just going to say that this was another one of those reasons why this was like a click book, or kind of like a validating book for me, was this chapter here. And I know you feel the same way because you're talking about all of your crazy tabs on your copy were mostly in this chapter, because for me, I feel like there's a lot of ways in which, I've also, leaving a cult, like especially later in life for me, found myself trying to kind of assimilate to the dominant culture, or at least understand it, and still just finding myself always an outsider, always kind of an alien, or just kind of confused by a lot of things. And then realizing, like, no, in my perspective, a lot of this is just kind of like a greater cult, or like a larger cult, or a larger series of cults. And I feel like that's something that he touches on in this book, about just like this robotization of people and this idea of brainwashing being predominant in society and culture. And that maybe that's just kind of part of human civilization, or like at least civilization in this realm of consciousness. So
I thought a lot about this book when I was recently reading that book that I had discussed earlier, Cultish by Amanda, whatever it is that I'm going to have to remember and put in the show notes. Respectfully, I'm so sorry for forgetting her name. She is a linguist. What you said about the overculture really being like the dominant culture, that book talks about the way that language controls people, and Wilson talks a lot about the way that symbol systems control people, and I think they really go hand in hand with each other. The things that we use to communicate, to pass down stories, laws, reason, faith, whatever from generation to generation. It's by language, as she puts it. And what he talks about in this book can almost be better understood, at least to me, in thinking about it in terms of language and the way that we communicate with people, because he kind of does touch on that in this book, but in so many other different words and not exactly relating it to language itself. I mean, clearly a book called Cultish by a linguist is going to be more directed on words and the way that we communicate and the effects that they have. And she more or less is saying that, you know, any group, any community, any brand has potential with the culture that they create, with the language that they use, and I think Wilson would say, with the reality tunnel that they set, or the expectations that they set. You can have varying levels of cultishness within groups that you really have to be careful. You have to decide whether or not it's dangerous. You have to question, is this group unsafe for me? Is this group making me feel like I can't leave? That book and this chapter in particular, I talk about basically like red flags and what to look for if it's like a cult in the terms that we view it, like a dangerous cult. Well, enough about cults. Let's move on to the next circuit.
Yeah, I thought this chapter was going to help me make sense of the Lost Card and the Crowley Toast Tarot, and it did not. I don't think this chapter helped me make sense of anything.
I took some notes on this chapter. I don't know if they're legible. I'm just going to read while I'm talking. So this is chapter 11, and it is the Holistic Neurosomatic Circuit. And it says, I think this is from the beginning of like chapter 2 or 3, where it describes and breaks down all of the circuits. It says, the Holistic Neurosomatic Circuit. This is imprinted by ecstatic experience via biological chemicals or chemical yogas. It processes neurosomatic, mind-body, feedback loops, somatic sensory bliss, feeling quote-unquote high, quote-unquote faith healing, etc. Christian Science, NLP, which is neuro-linguistic programming, and holistic medicine consist of tricks or gimmicks to get this circuit into action, at least temporary. Tantra Yoga is concerned with shifting consciousness entirely into this circuit. This circuit can be temporarily activated basically by certain types of yogas and weed, basically, or I think probably other psychedelic drugs. It's like that kind of altered state of consciousness.
The page here where it says, as early as 1968, a poll by McLaughlin showed that 85% of pot smokers in the country said their chief interest in the weed was its function as enhancer of erotic sensation. I'm going to call back what I said about this. This makes sense that he talks about the Lost Card in this chapter, because I feel like this is all about the idea that faith healing and rejuvenation are sort of on the same line as the idea of like bliss or ecstasy or rapture, and it's all about all the different ways that you can get there, I guess.
Which I hadn't really thought of until reviewing the book again right now, but that makes me wonder if just smoking weed can get you to this state of consciousness. Is it maybe just an altered state of thinking that some of these consciousness are? I mean, if the book is about changing your reality tunnel and your thinking, it really seems like some of these are activated by just changing your line of thinking. Or like not your line of thinking, but
your state of consciousness.
Yeah, by changing your state of consciousness, I wonder if getting drunk, you know what I'm saying, on like if there's a consciousness. Man, I don't want to sound ugly, but it might be more of like a conscious recession. Like you go back into some of the like earlier states by numbing parts of your mind or something. I don't know how alcohol works, really. I don't know anything.
Say that they talk about that in the anal circuit discussion. But, you know, we spent too much time talking about that.
Yeah, well, I think we just talked about poop and said anal because it was funny. I'm pretty sure that's where we ended the last one.
I wish I could remember what we talked about with the circuit. I know that that's kind of a fool's errand, but I remember that we both kind of like looked at this quote from Crowley where he talks about pranayama. I have a really ridiculous version of this. It's like on Audible where I just don't like the voice actor. He sounds very arrogant. I feel like we need to like play a clip of it, like smudge that in.
Yeah.
But it's like maybe for this one where he talks about pranayama, and it's so intense where he's like, for mind and body alike, for mind and body alike, there is no purgative like pranayama.
Oh
and
God,
I feel like
so
I
didn't
get
even like your voice when you
right.
when
Thank
you.
you. I don't like my voice either like
No,
that.
I was joking. That is really difficult.
But I feel
to
like
listen
when
to.
we talk about the circuit, that's kind of all I can get in my head is just that I almost don't want to do breath work because of that voice actor.
But that voice is what makes you need to do breath work.
Yeah, do we have did you have any specific notes written about this state? Because I do think you're raising an interesting thought that he talks about the models or circuits as like different models of consciousness, and he also talks about different kinds of altered states of consciousness, but he doesn't really identify if we're just talking about a different state. It's almost like the idea that the circuits are like a place mentally that you can reach, like where versus I think we're talking about something more temporary, and I'm wondering if that's ever kind of addressed in the book. Every time I look down, I'm like, oh, I think that this will be addressed in the book. It's not. There's more.
Sometimes I think there might be stuff that is addressed that I just overlook, but it just sheer... it's so annoying to keep hearing myself say, to try to describe this book as like an incomprehensible book, but I can't really stress enough that this book is not just like a once read. It's something that you read again and continue learning from, because I mean, I don't know, maybe there are people that can read all this and just comprehend it and it makes sense. There's something I'll just read from here that kind of helps break down this circuit in relation to the few previous to this. It says, in general, Fourth Circuit problems take the form of guilt. I cannot do what I am supposed to do. Third Circuit problems take the form of perplexity. I cannot understand how I got into this mess, or how to get out of it, or what is expected of me, etc. Second Circuit problems take the form of bullying or cowardice. I will force them, or I will surrender, or let them force me. First Circuit problems take the form of body symptoms. I feel rotten all over, gradually centering in, under enough stress, on acute disabling symptoms. It goes on to say, the Fifth Circuit neurosomatic consciousness bleaches out all of these problems at once, which makes it make a little more sense to me with the saying that certain yogas or that getting high can induce this consciousness because it's quieting your inner voice to some degree. I mean, if you really wanted to dumb down that circuit, it could be bimbofied. It could be bimboflicky. I really have to work on a way to say this. The bimbo way of understanding could be that it quiets your other senses. It calms. It's that state of mind or state of consciousness where you elevate past your anxieties, your symptoms, you find peace within. Meditation probably also, I would say. Obviously, I didn't write this, but it seems like this circuit is the state of mind of muting that part of your brain. I don't know. What do you think?
I feel like that's a good explanation, but I also just looked down and saw prolonged sexual play without orgasm always triggers some circuit 5 consciousness. So
damn,
it's also
spicy. So we go, a lot of different things can...
Yeah.
Interesting.
So
okay.
I thought about a challenge for you to have as exercise for this
God.
circuit. Attend a Sufi weekend seminar.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I don't know about a whole weekend
actually,
seminar of
commitment. We're not joiners.
Yeah, no, I'm not a joiner at all. I don't think that I would even dedicate an entire weekend to something that I liked. So I think that I had mentioned earlier in this episode, which we recorded at a different time, like going down a spiral of Sufism, and it all, not just seeing it pop up in a lot of the books that have been recommended to me or handed to me lately and not really knowing what it was. So I was saying that I was going to go in a rabbit hole and read, and I did buy a book that's like the essential Sufism or something. I don't know, but I will say that I got like not even an entire chapter in, and I realized that maybe this isn't a rabbit hole I need to go into, and not for any other reason that I think I might be a little bit burnt on my religious diggings for now. I feel like a lot of books that I've been given lately have had deep religious roots, and I am a little bit exhausted, and this one goes too deep. I think it's for me to learn about later.
I honestly love that.
I don't usually back up from a reading challenge, but sometimes my brain is like, you know what, this subject is actually not for me right now.
No, but I feel like knowing yourself is really important, and not feeling guilt or obligation to do something. Like I recently, this is such a mundane example, but I saw somebody basically expressing that they were not excited about the Barbie movie, and they felt really bad, like they felt apologetic, and they were apologizing, and I was like, I didn't say this, but I was like, you don't have to apologize for like not liking things, or even in this situation, just like not being interested or able to, or whatever the reason is, access that. I have a lot of respect and admiration for you saying that. Now that I'm thinking about all the Sufism aspect of it, I do feel like that is part of what helps me make sense of this chapter a little bit. Because I feel like one big thing that like Sufis are known for, that I think that Robert Anton Wilson is like relating them to, is like the idea of like whirling, and that like, if you ever heard the term like a whirling dervish, that this is like a act that they would engage in, just like spinning.
What?
You should like look up some photos, because it's just entrancing.
I've never heard of any of the things you're saying.
Yeah, so
now I'm re-interested. Maybe
I'm sorry.
Oh,
okay, but here's the thing. So I'm thinking about how it's an idea of like embodying meditation. It's not just meditation like sitting, crossing your legs, whatever. It's not passive. There's a physical aspect of it, and the physical aspect of it has to do with, one, exceeding like what the limitations that you feel like you're capable of, or like you butt up against that that your body gives you. And then also that like there's a state of ecstasy or rapture or a limit experience or altered state. So going back to what you're saying, that there's an altered consciousness that comes from that kind of active meditation. So I feel like maybe that's what he's trying to get across, that there are, to put it bluntly, like many different ways to skin a cat, that this is just one particular consciousness state, or I guess it's as its identified circuit, and then these are all the different ways we can access it. But maybe for me, why this one's kind of hard to grok is that I think this is all describing accessing things that I don't particularly have the dedication, focus, or self-control to typically get into, so I don't know.
Well, now you have instructions on how to, if you ever feel the desire, to hit up chapter 11.
Some of the exercises for this one are weird. We have learned how to do pranayama properly from an expert. I mean, this one's not really weird, but it says, parentheses, I have tried describing this elsewhere and found here there's no way to prevent gross errors in verbal transmission of this nonverbal knowledge. Get a Hindu to show you. I will say, I have tried learning breathwork from, like, folks who do not have a like Hindu background, or don't have like the background of like Ayurvedic philosophy, and my experiences with breathwork in that realm were not good, and I basically felt like they were telling me to hyperventilate, and maybe that's just how you're supposed to do it, but this chapter has kind of like renewed my interest in like getting in touch with that. I will say, the one time I tried to do actual pranayama, I just discovered I can pretty much never breathe through both my nostrils. So
I think what you were saying though about people not having the background trying to teach something, there is something to language that's not transmittable, and like how in some languages you can't really translate some words or verbiage to English or vice versa, because it really doesn't translate, because it kind of goes beyond. Gosh, it makes sense what I'm saying, but I'm not saying it.
You're Sufi. You're saying something that
that's me.
Those who cannot, those who don't taste don't know.
Yeah.
That whole idea, everyone's free to taste, but those who don't taste don't know. So you can't. I don't know. You can't like write what something tastes like. Yeah, that should just be the tagline for our podcast.
That's my Southern philosophy. You can't know what you don't know. Oh my God, that was so embarrassing, but I'm gonna leave it.
Yeah. Every time I like try to get back to our little notes, this book just wants to flip open somewhere else. The one that I thought was odd was just number 5, because the person's name is odd. It's Duh Free John, and it also says Duh Free John, an American guru. I just love how casually he says an American guru. Says you can reach illumination by constantly saying, "Who is the one who is living me now? Who is the one who is living me now?"
I don't like that.
That's
it makes
creepy.
me feel like there's a predator in my body. Like there's a spirit in me. I feel haunted by that. I'm gonna have nightmares by myself.
I'm gonna have nightmares of the idea of my ghost actually looks like a predator from the movie Predator.
Oh my god, because what if the person that's in me now is someone I don't like? Wait,
Aww.
Maybe I can control that. That seems like a... Oh my god, I hope my therapist never finds this podcast. Okay.
Well, we were also told number 3, is another book he says to acquire. Acquire my book, Sex and Drugs, A Journey Beyond Limits, and try the tantric exercises there described. I guess we're all supposed to ask ourselves about who is the one who's living me now. Who is it? Where is it? How old is it? I don't like
God,
that. Get the fuck out of here. And then the last one, Dr. Aidan Kelly has suggested the so-called unconscious is more conscious than the so-called conscious mind. That is, the unconscious contains all the feedbacks of the neurosomatic circuit and all the other circuits that maintain life. Consider this idea. Is this the one who is living you now? I hate the ominous ending.
He says that when this circuit begins to function, the person that is experiencing it tries to describe his or her rapture at oneness. The rationalist hastily mutters that this is merely subjective. Misery is merely subjective too, but that doesn't keep it from hurting. The neurosomatic skill of transmuting all experience so that one is high and happy in a situation where the four-circuited majority would be miserable is worth learning for the very simple, egotistic reason that it's more fun to be happy than to be in agony. And I really love that because I love to be in agony and it feels like he's yelling at me.
I feel like it basically is talking about like mystical experiences of like rapture, or like even what are called like Kundalini awakening, or just like oneness or pantheistic experiences.
Chapter is fairly short but fairly informative. It's something that people talk about. It's not an unknown concept to change your thinking or fix your mindset, as an influencer would probably say. But when you read it in terms of how to get control of it or how to use it as a tool, I think where this book misses the mark a little bit for probably a lot of people is his boldness in his way of thinking, even though that he continuously says, I'm probably wrong. Don't trust me. This is just basically my notes and processes. This is what I've thought and come up with, and this is what I want to be true, so this is what I'm going to talk about. I think that he was possibly overly optimistic about the way that we alter consciousness and the way that it'll be used in the future. I'm not going to talk about the uploading the consciousness that he talks about because I don't understand it too much, but I do think that he touches on these higher circuits, something that's sort of relevant, I guess. I mean, at this point in 2023 compared to 1972 or 73 when he wrote this book, it's far easier to grasp the idea of artificial intelligence being merged with human intelligence, because we're seeing it pretty rapidly expand and change, and just in the last 5 or 10 years it's just boomed into a new part of society that is just here. And I think that a lot of the people that studied consciousness expansion, consciousness uploading, how to integrate, artificial thoughts and consciousness control and maximizing your brain capacity and your brain ability. I feel like a lot of people that are studying and focusing on that right now in this time period are more like tech giants and big companies and artificial intelligence. Like, I feel like this brain hacking thing is so relevant because everything is like shifting and changing around us with these kinds of like crazy out there thoughts. Like, I don't think that I would be shocked if in 20 years they're talking about uploading the president's memory thoughts into an artificial intelligence capsule or something. I mean, it sounds so absurd. And even the first time I read through this book, some of the stuff and ideas that and how he thought some of these things could like positively change the world, it reminds me a lot of how, you know, we always just keep thinking with progress that things are going to keep getting better, but we somehow keep fucking it up as a human society. Like, we have computers and intelligence that can do anything for us, and we're still at our most vulnerable space in humanity where people by the millions are without homes, without food, slaving away at jobs where they can't even make ends meet and feed their family. And we have all this technology that should eradicate these struggles, but it doesn't. And so I have like concerns about the consciousness controlling and the way that that's being used. I think I just went way tinfoil hat, and I'm not even
You should, though.
Thank you.
I'm going to encourage that. You know, honestly, that was going to be my ping back for you, though, was to get a little tinfoil hat with it about what you were saying about him being overly optimistic, because I think that the ways in which he reads as being overly optimistic really are just that, okay, Bob, we love you. We love your imagination, and we love that you want to liberate everyone. And my thought is, are you not maybe considering that very powerful evil people also have this information? So, like, that's where I get conspiratorial, and I do think that some of it aged poorly, simply in the sense that things are not quite as optimistic and fantastic as he suggested that they could be. And I think primarily at the same time for all the same reasons that are laid out in the book initially, because there are so many different ways in which our mind functions and levels in which that we don't typically spend the time expanding our mind or researching about it or even just seeking to like know this. But there are definitely people who that's their whole job, and sometimes they're employed by advertisers or by people who are wanting to like manipulate different technologies, or politicians, or whomever. And I do think that maybe he didn't consider in writing that. And I struggle to suggest that he didn't consider that, considering, you know, Robert Anton Wilson did literally write like the book on conspiracies by the Illuminati.
But you know what, what you were talking about reminded me, I hear people, a lot of left-leaning folks say this about the right, about them, you know, the issue is that the conservative people are far more organized because they want it more. But I think, like you were saying, touching back on like how advertisers are the ones that study this, or big corporations, I think typically speaking, the most organized, focused people are, in my opinion, usually the most evil. They're usually the most fueled with the need for, like, the need to be on top, the need to have the billions, the need to be known. So those are the kind of people that like hyper aware study and focus on this stuff. So it's important for the rest of us to do it too, you know, or else they're just going to keep taking over the world. There's some exercises at the end of this chapter 2. I didn't read through all of them. Number 2 is to attend a Sufi weekend seminar.
I can lend you a book that's by Idris Shah, which is a writer that Robert Anton Wilson quotes often, called The Sufis, and it's like kind of his attempt at bringing forward Sufi history and Sufi philosophy as he sees it towards a Western audience, but also from the perspective of a Sufi practitioner and someone who is like of that lineage. So it's like, I don't know, there's a lot of debate about what Sufism is, what and like whether or not it's a religion, whether or not it's tied specifically to Islam, whether or not it's a philosophy. So Shaw's work's a little bit controversial in that regard too, but I really enjoy it, and it sent me down some really good rabbit holes.
Controversy and rabbit holes.
So I love that you're saying that, because I've had this same experience with Sufism, and I probably started, or at least was exacerbated by Robert Anton Wilson's work.
I think that's probably how, okay, well, do you want to go on to our next circuit, the collective neurogenic circuit, chapter 12?
It is no longer only the right that is conservative. The entire left is also suddenly conservative. The liberal and the radical left have fallen behind. Yeah. So that's also really interesting. I think there's a lot of different ways that it could be unpacked. That's something that me and my spouse were talking about earlier in the day, was just like the idea of Puritanism and like policing of sexuality, and the way that can also happen concurrent to like sexual liberation, or like the views of like being more free, which kind of goes back into what Ra was saying about cults and stuff, interestingly. Not that I'm trying to connect these two thoughts really. Maybe not. Maybe subconsciously.
Talking about this book will make you question
but this was a
what
very,
you're saying.
But that's actually, maybe we can just follow that thread for a minute, because I do think sometimes that's where you can, at least I start to identify like that danger or like thought policing happening. There's value in like questioning what it is that you're saying, and being able to like just kind of think thoughts that are atypical or different from what you actually may even believe or agree with, but just entertain them. And I think that's just a continued overall lesson that he has very creative ways of demonstrating with the exercises, but ultimately is just like what we're being called to kind of try and do. And I think sometimes it can be so interesting how like there's just that sense that there's a little bit of danger in doing that, I guess, or like a danger in letting yourself ramble too much, or like that's something we talk about outside of recording a lot, of like having to feel like we second guess ourselves, or I don't know what I'm saying, or I don't know where I'm going with that. Well, like, I don't know, maybe we don't always have to have a point.
That's a very important thing to remember, that sometimes I think just being able to let yourself talk without policing your thoughts, or wondering if that's the politically correct way of saying something, or wondering too much about how other people are going to perceive it, that you really work through a lot more by just disgusting your words. I don't know what I'm saying. So
this is some good. We've both had some fun word mashups.
Yeah, sometimes I go through and listen to this audio, and I hear myself like saying two words and merging them into one at the same time. I'm like, I can't fix that.
It's just a new word that you've created.
The sixth circuit. That's a tongue twister. That this is where your brain kicks into action, where the nervous system begins to receive signals from within the individual neuron. From the RNA-DNA dialogue, the neurogenetic feedback system. He talks about this being, here it is. This is how this system connects your DNA, your RNA, with your central nervous system. And then he goes into the collected unconscious and the Akashic records and a lot of stuff that has nothing to do with the other four original points of psychologies. It says the neurogenetic circuit is best considered in terms of current science as the genetic archives activated by excitement of antihistone proteins, the DNA memory coiling back to the dawn of life and containing also the genetic blueprints for the future of evolution. I am he that was, and is, and shall be, a sentence from the Egyptian Book of the Dead. And it says also on that, it goes on and it says, in hieroglyphic, in his own handwriting, that quote was found on the desk of Beethoven when he composed his Ninth Symphony. He talks a lot about it being your DNA, your RNA, and your central nervous system being connected to the collected unconscious. And this is similar, I like the records of human history and how it's all connected and we are one. And is like a group of, like a religious group of sorts that's basically like their bigger belief that we're bigger than the sum of our parts, and that God is everything. God is water, God is sky, God is us, God is, the universe is all experiencing itself, it's all one. And he talks about this circuit like containing basically the blueprints, is what he says, to hack into understanding this.
I know this is a difficult one. I was like, as I'm reviewing it, I really wish this particular chapter were longer, because it's such a big idea to grok, and I feel like it's also one of those things where Ra is usually pretty grounded in a lot of like consensus reality, to borrow his term. And here he just jumps in, and we're talking about Blavatsky and Akashic Records and DNA. And this is the thing that's really interesting to me, though, is that there wasn't really, as far as I know, research about epigenetics and like genetic memory at the time, which is something he talks about a lot in this. And yet that's something that like is now a big point of study, like as far as I know, like with the realms of genetics, is like how much of our genetic history affects our behavior as well as our like health. And so this was a really interesting like lens to kind of consider this chapter with, but it is very I guess esoteric in nature. And he talks about synchronicities. I mean, there's just the next paragraph after what you were talking about with Beethoven just jumps into so much. So I don't know how we would really summarize it. It is just one that I will say I appreciate all of the references to Beethoven. I thought they were so interesting because I've always loved like his music, like as someone like listening to classical music as a child, just from like playing violin and whatnot. It was like one of my favorite composers. Also, like, emo kid, I have to have like Rachmaninoff and Beethoven and like the dramatic composers. And it's so cool like studying, I guess, like especially tarot from a more esoteric lens. There's a lot of connections to his work and a lot of ways in which people have later speculated that Beethoven was like perhaps a magician or esotericist. And I never really noticed all of the Beethoven info that he drops in this book or in this chapter.
He talks about it a lot.
Kind of standing out to me more now.
It's not just in this chapter either, and I didn't realize that, or even, I think, pay it much mind when I read through it a lot, but he talks about Beethoven as someone who was like an example mind, someone who was able to connect to most of these circuits, and that it was visible through his music. He talks about how Beethoven's music like physically moves people. There's a quote, I don't know where this one is. I never have the good quotes. I never have the good notes. It just like pops into my
If you paraphrase it, I could probably search the
so he
PDF
talks about something that Lenin had said about listening to Beethoven, and how essentially that Lenin said you don't listen to Beethoven because that gets your guard down, in more or less words. He's like, and you can't let something do that to you. But it speaks to the fact that how once you're able, or in his like view when he's talking about it, once you're able to like connect to that part of your brain, it's just like you can't undo it. You can't come back from that. Like once you connect on this level. And he talks about Beethoven as someone who is like a rare entity that learned not only how to do this in his own conscious mind, but to compose it and put it forth so that other people can feel it, even if they can't explain it, which is pretty cool. Gosh, I wish I was as smart as Beethoven, but that just ain't it. He also quotes, he quotes a lot from Korzybski, not just in this book, but in a lot of books. And there's something that Korzybski said: when we split verbally that which is never split existentially, we introduce fallacies into our thinking. And I think he put that in this circuit, particularly because he's talking about the human DNA records, like the universal truth, the universal understanding. And he's saying that, we've all got our own opinions and critiques, and we're not tapped into this, so we're all trying to verbalize things that can't be, and that's how we introduce these fallacies into our thinking, at least in the context of this chapter in that book, I think is how he meant it. But like you said, this chapter is really short. Even the exercises on it, here's exercise 1, list at least 15 similarities between New York or any large city and an insect colony, such as a beehive or a termite hill. Contemplate the information in the DNA loop which created both of these enclaves of high coherence and organization in primate and insect societies. So, interesting, but difficult to discuss, which is pretty much the theme for the rest of this book, because the next circuit, this one was a short few pages. The next circuit is 2 chapters. So chapter 13 is the introduction to the metaprogramming circuit, and chapter 14 is the metaprogramming circuit. I think that's what it's just called. Yeah, just the meta.
I think you talking about Beethoven kind of gave me some idea of how we would conceptualize what these past 2 chapters were about. I think that the last chapter was really about having some experience or connection to like the numinous, which is what I think a term that both Jung uses, and I think honestly also Carl Sagan maybe uses, which I just think of as, being this like, you could say divinity or something beyond yourself. This chapter that we're discussing now is like this sense of finding a scientific reality, or also some kind of like spiritual reality that is in you, because that second exercise is read the Upanishads, and every time you see the word Atman or world soul, which Atman also I think means like incarnation or like individual, I could look that up, translate it as DNA blueprint, see if that makes sense to you in any way. So also kind of what you were saying is like there's an implication that your essence is unified in some way, which is definitely, I think he falls into the line of philosophers or thinkers that veer towards a kind of like universalist thinking, and like idea that like things like unified field theory or different like scientific conceptions also prove things like Buddhism or Hinduism true, in the sense that like we are all part of different interconnected web. Like in Cosmic Trigger, and probably this book too, he talks about Indra's net, which is a really pretty visual metaphor for consciousness, and he talks about it in regards to like also consciousness, but kind of like from a scientific thought. Maybe that's what I kind of took away from this chapter, was that this is how, or what he's trying to describe, because it is just, otherwise I'm like, what exactly is this particular circuit? And I probably wouldn't labor over trying to conceptualize it in a neat little box if it weren't for the fact that it's labeled.
What I like that your key takeaways oftentimes are totally opposite than mine, and sometimes spot on the same. And I think that this makes for great discussion with you in these books, because I didn't even, like that one that you just read, I hadn't even really thought of. I didn't even look up the word Atman. I was just like, sometimes I get burnt out reading. I'm like, I don't know what this is. I'll just keep going, and then maybe it'll make sense, or something else will make sense. So when you pick up something like that, it makes me feel real excited, because I'm like, I'm learning again.
Hell yeah. Oh, I love that. I feel like we always have a good contrast.
Gosh, we are killing through this book. So this next, maybe we can talk about chapters 13 and 14 kind of together, because 13 is the introduction to 14. And he talks about, in the introduction, there's a story about like mass hallucination and like believing something because that's what your reality tunnel wants you to believe. He says each of us is trapped in the reality tunnel of assumption consumption. His or her brain has manufactured. We do not see it or sense it. It is a model our brain has created. We automatically, unconsciously, mechanically see and sense it out there, apart from us, and we consider it objective. When we meet somebody whose separate tunnel reality is obviously far different from ours, we are a bit frightened and always disoriented. We tend to think they are mad, or they are crooks, or they are trying to con us in some way, or that they are hoaxsters playing a joke. I like that he says hoaxsters. Yet it is neurologically obvious that no two brains have the same genetically programmed hardwiring, the same imprints, the same conditioning, the same level learning experiences. We are all living in separate realities. That is why communication fails so often, and misunderstandings and resentments are so common. I say meow, and you say bow wow, and each of us is convinced the other is dumb. I liked that little excerpt because I see how that could be summarized as an intro to understanding what this next circuit is about. Not being able to see things from the point of view as someone in a different reality tunnel, thinking another person's crazy for not being able to see, like not being able to understand why they're in this thought process.
We talked a lot about the different images in this book, and maybe a helpful one to actually put up will be the appendix images, where it shows the different circuits. And it labels them and shows them in different example stages. And a lot of times it doesn't show them, like they're not always happening, or maybe it just shows 5 of them, or they happen non-linearly. And I thought that was just a really helpful visual image to get in mind what the circuits could mean in regards to an individual's life, because I just think it's very easy to think of things in a prescripted, kind of like upward, like you were saying, a continual progress kind of script, which he even, describes as being sort of a social cultural conditioning, and I would definitely agree with. But it's hard not to think of things in that upward way. So I just did like that, and I kind of wanted to shout that out as far as different ways that you could think of the circuits, because ultimately I think they're just describing different stages of development and ways that we can view and access our mind. It's not necessarily meant to be something that the average person could, I think, hypothetically go through and unlock all of them, but like you were saying about people like Beethoven, at least as far as Robert Anton Wilson regards it, it's almost like that's a sort of outlier. Most of us aren't necessarily going to check all these boxes, and I also think that that's okay in his eyes and in mine.
That's really beautifully put. And like you said, the rest of these circuits in this book, it's non-linear, like you said. It's not this is the next step, and this whole next circuit, the metaprogramming circuit, it's basically talking about your soul. He even says in this chapter, here it is, the metaprogramming circuit, known as the quote-unquote soul in Gnosticism, or the no mind in China, white light, the void in Tibetan Buddhism. So he's kind of borrowing from other places and putting them on this list of consciousness as like an aid, another thing that you can use. It's almost as if this book is his 8-step program to how he took better control of his conscious mind and where he expects it to go from there by integrating different practices outside of yourself.
I feel like you just gave as good of a summary as we've been able to come up with for the book,
I think that
honestly.
the rest of the chapters after that aren't even, the circuits. I think that the metaprogramming circuit is the last circuit. Oh, no. Non-local quantum circuit. But I can't, I don't think there's any way to even describe that. And I do think that with what we've done here, if you are interested in learning more, I challenge you to read the non-local quantum circuit by yourself. I will say that he compares it a lot to James Joyce writing, which I can't comprehend, and I can't I can't even begin to tear apart. Prometheus Rising, like you said, I think this book really is aimed at people that are interested in, I wouldn't say self-help, but I would say self-bettering. So people that enjoy reading about things they feel like they can apply to their self, their mind, to personal, people that like personal challenges, people that want to dig into mysticism and the weird, people that are okay with reading a little hokey and a little out there in between personality and quantum physics and brainwashing, I think that book would be for you. Overall, I started off with this book thinking I'll never get through it, and I ended up reading and rereading most of it. I really love this book. I love the way that it challenged me to think. I like the weird conversations that it sparked.
Yeah, I love that. And I feel like, what you're saying is it really makes this sort of like his offering as far as how he understood and saw things at the time that he wrote them, as far as a way that's beneficial and helpful to other people, because a lot of his work was always aimed at like what can be of benefit. And so I do think that maybe like self-help or self-improvement is an overly trite way of putting it, but I don't know what exactly you would classify that as. And I do think that anyone with a willingness to introspect, like maybe some level of curiosity about themselves on a deeper level, someone who's willing to think, this book is definitely up their alley, and I'm looking forward to hearing from other people who might read it as a result of listening to this. I definitely do have PDF copies that I'm happy to like email or share. Yeah, I mean, I want to shout out and say, like, obviously I always want to support living artists and support people's work and buying their works, but given that he's passed away, and as far as I know, I mean, I shouldn't say that no one's receiving money from his work. I do know he has living relatives, and there's been an effort to archive and reprint his work, which I'm very supportive of. But if that's a barrier between you reading it.
So he says here, there is no reason to accept the tunnel reality of this book is final. If you really understand the message, you will invent a bigger and better future than I have suggested. As Barbara Marx Hubbard says, the future exists first in imagination, then in will, then in reality. Thanks for hanging out and listening. You can be a part of the conversation by emailing us at bimbobookshelf@gmail.com, Instagram @bimbobookshelf, or voicemail via Anchor. Please send us your comments and questions on Ishmael by Daniel Quinn, the next book we'll be discussing on the Bimbo Bookshelf pod. If you've enjoyed the show today, please feel free to subscribe and leave us a sweet 5-star review, or just tell a friend. It helps us recruit the others. Until next time.